By the end of the 1960s, the classic monsters of the past were being replaced by something far more cynical and carnal. It was a year when the Gothic elegance of the old guard met the rising tide of the counterculture, resulting in a genre that felt increasingly paranoid, psychedelic, and transgressive. Tonight, we're looking at 10 overlooked titles from 1969. These films capture a pivotal moment in time where the traditional boundaries of taste were dissolving and the horror was moving from haunted castles into the dark corners of the human psyche. From the lush European surrealism of the nascent Giallo to the raw, gritty violence of the American drive-in, these stories represent the closing chapter of one era and the violent birth of another.
Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, 1969. Hunted by the police, the brilliant and utterly ruthless Baron Victor Frankenstein hides in a middle-class boarding house. He quickly discovers that the landlady's fiancé is a young doctor who black markets medical supplies. Using this leverage, Frankenstein blackmails the young couple into assisting him with his most radical experiment yet, curing the insanity of his former colleague, Dr. Brandt, by transplanting his brilliant brain into a brand new body. Directed by Terence Fisher, this fifth entry in Hammer Films' Frankenstein saga is widely considered the peak of the entire franchise. The film strips away any lingering romanticism surrounding the mad scientist trope, transforming the Baron into a cold, manipulative sociopath. Peter Cushing delivers a ferocious performance, weaponizing his usual aristocratic charm into something genuinely terrifying. The cinematography shifts the series away from classic Gothic castles, placing the horrors within brightly lit, claustrophobic domestic spaces that emphasize the tragic collateral damage of the Baron's obsession. Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed stands out for its uncompromisingly bleak tone and fast narrative pacing. Instead of creating a traditional lumbering monster, the narrative focuses on the psychological horror of a man waking up trapped inside a stranger's flesh. The production features incredibly gruesome practical medical effects for its era, including a highly detailed, tense brain surgery sequence. It remains a definitive, cynical masterpiece of British horror, proving that the real monster of the story isn't the creation, but the creator himself. One on top of the other, 1969. In San Francisco, a wealthy, manipulative doctor is caught in a web of deceit when his asthmatic wife dies, leaving him with a massive $2 million life insurance payout. Soon after, an anonymous tip leads the police to suspect foul play, and the doctor is quickly arrested and sentenced to death. However, his defense attorney uncovers a shocking twist. A high-priced Parisian stripper bears a flawless, uncanny physical resemblance to the supposedly deceased wife, triggering a labyrinthine mystery where nothing is as it seems. Directed by Lucio Fulci, this stylish Italian-French co-production, originally titled Una sull'altra, is a crucial evolutionary milestone in the development of the erotic thriller. Before he became world-famous for his hyper-violent 1980s zombie films, Fulci was a master of psychological suspense. The film relies heavily on a sleek European art house aesthetic, utilizing dreamlike editing, split-screen transitions, and mirror reflections to keep the audience entirely disoriented. The cinematography transforms the fog-shrouded streets of San Francisco and the stark interiors of San Quentin prison into a cold, clinical trap. The production stands out for its high-concept narrative construction and its sophisticated jazz-fused soundtrack, composed by Riz Ortolani. Jean Sorel delivers an excellent, ambiguous performance as the cornered doctor, playing beautifully alongside Marissa Mel's dual role. The narrative completely eschews traditional Gothic horror elements, focusing instead on themes of identity theft, corporate greed, and sexual obsession within high society. It remains an essential, overlooked classic of international genre cinema, laying the direct, structural, and visual blueprint for later Hollywood neo-noirs. The Cremator, 1969. In the shadow of the impending Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, Karel Kopfer-Kingel is a fastidious worker at a Prague crematorium. He views his grim profession as a holy mission, obsessed with a distorted interpretation of Tibetan mysticism, the idea that incinerating the body liberates the soul from earthly suffering. As he is lured into the Nazi party by a manipulative friend, Carroll's latent madness blooms. He begins to see his work, and his own family, through the lens of a deranged, purifying ideology, transforming from a quirky bourgeois father into a cold-blooded architect of death. Directed by Juraj Hertz, this masterpiece of the Czechoslovak New Wave is a pitch-black psychological horror. The film is defined by its disorienting visual style, utilizing extreme wide-angle lenses and a unique form of associative editing, where scenes bleed into one another across time and space to mirror Carroll's fractured psyche. Rudolf Hrushinsky delivers an unforgettable performance, imbuing Carroll with a soft-spoken, polite veneer that makes his homicidal turn all the more terrifying. The Cremator is a profound and disturbing allegory for how easily the banality of everyday life can be co-opted by totalitarian evil. Released briefly in 1969, before being vaulted by the authorities for 20 years, it blends macabre humor with a chillingly accurate portrayal of radicalization. It suggests that the most dangerous monsters are those who believe they are performing a compassionate service for humanity. It remains a visually stunning and deeply uncomfortable experience, standing as one of the most unique satires of the 20th century. The House That Screamed, 1969. In late 19th century France, a strict headmistress runs a secluded boarding school for wayward young women with an iron fist. Under the guise of moral correction, she subjects her pupils to severe discipline, unaware that a greater threat is stalking the grounds. When a rebellious new student arrives, she uncovers a pattern of sudden disappearances among the residents. Deep within the dark corridors of the estate, a hidden predator is systematically abducting the girls, executing a gruesome plan that builds toward an unforgettable twist. Directed by Narciso Ibáñez Serrador, this Spanish production, originally titled La Residencia, is a milestone of European horror that heavily influenced the Italian Giallo boom and American slasher subgenre. Serrador relies on a slow-burning psychological tension, transforming the rigid school into a suffocating pressure cooker of repressed desires and institutional cruelty. The cinematography is remarkably elegant, utilizing tracking shots through the Gothic architecture and high-contrast lighting to create an atmosphere of mounting claustrophobia. The House That Screamed is a masterclass in Gothic suspense that subverts period drama elegance into psychological terror. The film stands out for its cold, clinical restraint, prioritizing a creeping sense of dread over immediate shock value. The soundtrack heightens this tension by mixing a classical score with sudden, jarring silences and the echoey sounds of the secluded mansion. It remains an essential, boundary-pushing piece of international genre history, demonstrating how structural authority can blind a society to the violent monsters hiding right under its roof. Satan's Sadists, 1969. Deep in the sweltering California desert, a ruthless, drug-fueled outlaw motorcycle gang, led by the psychopathic Anchor, terrorizes the isolated highways. After brutally murdering a young couple in cold blood, the bikers track two surviving witnesses, a hitchhiking Marine veteran and a diner waitress, to a remote, sun-baked pit stop. Trapped in the middle of nowhere with no outside help, the survivors are forced into a grueling, violent game of cat and mouse against the gang, relying on raw survival instincts to fight back against their sadistic tormentors. Directed by Al Adamson, this landmark exploitation feature is a raw, gritty time capsule that captured the dark, violent underbelly of the late 1960s counterculture movement. Released just months before the real-world Manson family murders shocked the nation, the film accurately tapped into a growing cultural anxiety regarding lawless desert cults and drifters. Cinematographer Gary Graver rejects slick Hollywood polish, utilizing a harsh, overexposed documentary style that makes the desert heat feel palpable and the sudden bursts of graphic violence feel jarringly realistic. The production stands out for its uncompromising B-movie energy and its highly influential biker aesthetic. Russ Tamblyn delivers a fiercely eccentric, unsettling performance as Anchor, completely shedding his clean-cut musical background to embody a menacing, unpredictable gang leader. Supported by a driving fuzz guitar rock soundtrack, the narrative moves at a relentless pace, prioritizing shocking action and tension over deep psychological nuance. It remains a definitive, dust-covered drive-in classic, capturing a pivotal moment where independent cinema shifted toward raw, unvarnished exploitation. Venus in Furs, 1969. While wandering along a fog-blanketed beach in Istanbul, an American jazz musician discovers the washed-up, lifeless body of a beautiful young woman. Horrified yet captivated, he soon relocates to Rio de Janeiro, only to be stunned when the exact same woman appears alive and well at a high society party. As he is drawn into her orbit, he realizes she is systematically seducing and destroying the wealthy, decadent hedonists who previously abused and murdered her, dragging the musician into a surreal, erotic web of psychological vengeance. Directed by Jess Franco, this international co-production is a hypnotic, dreamlike masterpiece of late 1960s psych noir. The narrative entirely discards linear storytelling, unfolding instead like a slow, hallucinatory fever dream floating between reality and supernatural fantasy. Cinematographer Angelo Bistrocchi captures the film through a dizzying array of saturated colors, slow-motion sequences, and sudden predatory camera zooms that emphasize the story's heavy, intoxicating obsession. The production trades Gothic castles for ultra-modern, mid-century villas and sun-drenched beaches, giving the horror a sleek, avant-garde aesthetic. The film stands out as a sensory experience, prioritizing mood, texture, and visual poetry over standard plot logic. James Darren delivers an appropriately dazed, flat performance as the wandering musician, perfectly mirroring the audience's confusion, alongside Maria Rome's ethereal, icy presence as the vengeful specter. The production is brilliantly anchored by a legendary psychedelic jazz soundtrack composed by Manfred Mann, which functions as a fluid narrative voice. It remains a definitive, boundary-pushing artifact of Eurocult cinema, transforming a classic ghost story into a dazzling avant-garde exploration of trauma and desire. 99 Women, 1969. On a remote sun-baked island fortress, a sadistic governor and a cruel head matron rule a women's penal colony with absolute authority. The inmates are subjected to systematic torture, hard labor, and psychological degradation, entirely cut off from the outside world. When a sympathetic new female warden arrives, she attempts to introduce humane reforms, only to clash with the corrupt administration. As tensions boil over and a desperate escape attempt through the jungle turns deadly, the prisoners realize their only chance for survival is a violent, full-scale uprising. Directed by Jess Franco, this international co-production is a foundational cornerstone of the women in prison exploitation subgenre. Franco discards traditional dramatic pacing, opting instead for a highly atmospheric, dreamlike visual style. The film relies heavily on intense close-ups, sweeping zoom shots, and high-contrast lighting to capture the oppressive, sweat-soaked isolation of the island. Rather than relying on big-budget spectacle, the production weaponizes its natural Mediterranean locations and bleak stone cell blocks to create a palpable sense of hopeless captivity. The film stands out as a raw, fascinating time capsule of late 1960s exploitation cinema, pushing past international censorship boundaries. Despite its low-budget grindhouse pedigree, the project features a surprisingly prestigious cast, including Maria Schell and Oscar winner Mercedes McCambridge, who bring a fierce, dramatic intensity to their roles. Supported by a moody, lounge-infused psychedelic jazz score, the narrative focuses on the dark psychological effects of institutional power. It remains an essential, boundary-pushing cult classic that established the exact cinematic tropes and visual language the subgenre would duplicate for the next 2 decades. Whatever Happened to Aunt Alice? 1969. When her husband dies, leaving her entirely bankrupt, aristocratic widow Claire Marable relocates to a Tucson desert estate, determined to maintain her high society lifestyle. To fund her existence, she devises a cold-blooded routine, hiring elderly, isolated housekeepers, convincing them to invest their life savings into her business schemes, and then murdering them. After burying her victims in the garden under a newly planted pine tree, she hires Mrs. Dimmock. Unbeknownst to the widow, this eccentric new housekeeper is an undercover friend of a previous victim, deliberately placing herself in a deadly game of wits to uncover the truth. Produced by Robert Aldrich, this suspenseful thriller serves as the spiritual successor to his earlier psycho-bitty masterpieces like Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Geraldine Page gives a masterfully haughty, cold performance as the calculating widow, contrasting beautifully with Ruth Gordon's sharp, undercover investigator. The cinematography weaponizes the open, stark Arizona desert, replacing Gothic shadows with a scorching, isolated vastness where help is miles away. The film relies entirely on psychological friction and sharp dialogue rather than graphic violence. The tension builds through ordinary domestic objects: a missing book page, a handwriting sample, and a row of unusually healthy pine trees growing in the dry sand. Supported by a jarring, discordant musical score, the narrative focuses on the financial desperation lurking behind the facade of upper-class elegance. It remains a wonderfully mean-spirited, overlooked piece of late 1960s cinema that concludes with a brutal stroke of cosmic irony, highlighting two legendary actresses matching wits at the height of their powers. The Oblong Box, 1969. In 19th century England, aristocrat Julian Markham keeps a dark secret locked away in the attic of his ancestral mansion. His twin brother, Edward, who was horribly disfigured during a mysterious, occult ritual in Africa. Desperate to escape his captivity, Edward fakes his own death with the help of a corrupt local doctor. The plan goes awry when grave robbers exhume the coffin and hand it over to a brilliant local surgeon, leaving Edward free to roam the fog-shrouded streets, hiding his face behind a crimson mask as he seeks bloody vengeance against his captors. Directed by Gordon Hessler, this atmospheric British production marks a fascinating transition point for American International Pictures, shifting their profitable line of Edgar Allan Poe adaptations from the Hollywood soundstages of Roger Corman to authentic English locations. The narrative successfully weaves classic Gothic tropes, such as body snatching, family curses, and Victorian medical experimentation, with a more modern, visceral approach to on-screen violence. The film is structurally anchored by the legendary presence of Vincent Price as Julian, who brings a tragic, brooding dignity to a man crushed under the weight of his family's hidden sins. The production relies heavily on striking contrasts, juxtaposing the lavish, candlelit interiors of the Markham estate with the gritty, mud-slicked alleys inhabited by the criminal underclass. Christopher Lee provides excellent dramatic support as the cold, pragmatic Dr. Netherby, whose illegal anatomical studies inadvertently spark Edward's killing spree. Supported by a moody, brass-heavy score, the narrative digs into themes of imperialist guilt and corporate corruption, transforming an ordinary revenge story into a bleak portrait of historical sins returning to destroy the present. Night of the Bloody Apes, 1969. Desperate to save his dying son from a terminal heart condition, a brilliant surgeon conducts a radical, highly illegal medical experiment. He kidnaps a powerful laboratory gorilla, surgically removes its heart, and transplants it into his son's chest. While the procedure initially succeeds, the simian organ triggers a horrific cellular mutation, transforming the young man into a hulking, mindless beast. Driven by uncontrollable predatory instincts, the mutated son escapes into the city streets, embarking on a violent rampage of assault and murder, while his desperate father scrambles to cover up the bloody evidence. Directed by René Cardona, this notorious Mexican exploitation feature, originally titled La Horripilante Bestia Humana, is a legendary staple of grindhouse cinema that completely discards restraint. Cardona weaves elements of classic mad scientist thrillers with the visceral, raw energy of the emerging 1970s splatter genre. The film is visually defined by its jarring tonal shifts, jumping between vibrant, masked lucha libre wrestling matches and stark, shocking sequences of graphic violence. The production utilizes highly creative, low-budget practical effects and crude prosthetics to bring its monstrous, disfigured killer to life. The film stands out as a fascinating, chaotic relic of international drive-in history, pushing censorship boundaries to their absolute limit. The narrative moves at a relentless, B-movie pace, relying on a loud, discordant soundtrack and sudden close-ups to shock the audience. It completely eschews subtle psychological tension, prioritizing pure, unadulterated shock value and campy theatricality instead. It remains a definitive example of underground exploitation filmmaking, offering a wild, boundary-pushing viewing experience where medical science, monster movie tropes, and Mexican wrestling culture violently collide.
That's it for tonight's episode. If you want to help us keep the archive alive and growing, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the bell. And remember, always be kind and rewind, because every movie is somebody's favorite.